Many English historians, I think, and some today, are hesitant about placing the development of the setting for royal life in pre-conquest England in the kind of context which would be perfectly normal in the continent. The evidence we have from Aachen, from Paris, for example, from Ingelheim, and many, many other places, provide us with the evidence for massive residential complexes in close association with massive churches. And to give you just one idea, from Aachen, everybody thinks, who looks at this and has been to Aachen and so on, thinks what a magnificent and enormous complex that church is. It's no bigger than Winchester. But beside it, there is the colossal complex with the Royal Hall, which still exists intact. And we have excavated royal halls. Some of you will know about Ingelheim. I hope you won't believe the early 20th century magnificent plans and reconstructions. The Germans have recently published a drawing which shows the bits that were actually found. And you can sort of join up the dots if you want to. It, however, is an enormous complex. And I think it's also clear that the same sort of thing was happening elsewhere, whether it be in France, as it is today, or in Italy, or Spain. But the evidence is, for this country, not easy, and we have two Anglo-Saxon palaces which have been extensively excavated. One is at Yevering for the 7th and 8th century in Northumbria, massive, highly sophisticated timber buildings, including one that looks like the wedge of an amphitheatre, and therefore may have been a place where it was possible to have on banked tiers, not wholly unlike what you're sitting on, addressing something was happening below. But that may, of course, be a religious complex. But there are huge residential halls, albeit built of timber. They are extremely complicated, and they have been well reconstructed in a number of studies. They're major, technologically major, important structures. And the other one, of course, is Cheddar, particularly associated with the name of Alfred, where excavations by my old friend Philip Raats in the 1970s produced another series of great timber halls on a building which we know of. Right. No. First thing I must say is to tell you about the palaces I'm not going to talk about. Of course, Winchester is a much bepalaced place, as you know. There is, of course, the great castle, in which clearly there were all the accoutrements of royal residence emerging perhaps already in the late 11th century, but certainly in a major way in the 12th century, and in the second half of the 12th century, very well documented in surviving royal documents, with halls and residential buildings and other structures on a very large embanked fortified site. And later, of course, we have Winchester's finest secular medieval building, the Castle Hall, the Great Hall, once described as the finest aisled hall from medieval England to survive, which is, of course, a royal hall built originally in the reign of Henry III, and a major element in the royal complex, which was then the royal residence in Winchester, and for which we have a great deal both of documentary evidence, some physical evidence in the nature of the hall, and so forth. But I'm not going to talk about that. That's later. That doesn't start until after the Norman conquest, when the castle was begun in the autumn of 1066, perhaps a little bit later than that, by enclosing a great salient on the Roman defences of Winchester by the simple business of building a new ditch on the eastern side. But I'm not going to talk about that anymore. Then there's also the Bishop's Palace at Wolvesey in the southeastern quarter. Very interesting, in the 12th century, it's described as a domus, a house, quasi palatium, as if it were a palace. And historians are quite worried about the use of the word palatium in English records, and are not at all sure that it really represents what we today would call a palace, like Buckingham Palace or indeed those relevant parts of Windsor and so forth. And there's been a lot of doubt has been expressed at various times, and many attempts have been made. And I speak recently when Beatrice Clare, who's here, and I have been completing the gazetteer for the Historic Towns Atlas with entries, for example, for the palaces, for the castle, for Wolsey. And we have been coming up against the problems of what exactly really sometimes do these words mean. But domus quasi palatium, a house as if it were a palace, as if the word palace means something more than just the residence of a bishop. And in this case, perhaps, an indication that this was a rather overmighty bishop. And Henry of Blois was, of course, precisely that. So there are problems of terminology, but there are perfectly good, well-evidenced contemporary uses of the word palatium, the Latin word, in pre-conquest sources for Winchester. And so it is most certainly used. So those two buildings, the castle and Wolsey, we'll leave to one side. And I want to talk now about what I think I can call the royal centre, the royal quarter of Winchester. One of the most amazing things about Winchester, which we experience on the ground every day, those of us who live here, but which we can also see very clearly from the air and see on maps, such as you'll be seeing, is that the southeastern quarter, the German word Viertel keeps on coming into my mind because there's a lot of literature on this kind of things in German. And it is a quarter, really, almost literally, of our city. And that air photograph, taken sometime in the 1960s when excavations were taking place north of the cathedral, shows, of course, the central building that's there today. A building which my friend Eric Fernie has recently described in his great book on English Romanesque architecture as a building of imperial pretension. And that is because it's a description of the church which he loves so much, Speyer, which is the great German late 11th century building of the emerging rulers of that area. Winchester Cathedral is an enormous building. It is the longest nave in Europe, was only exceeded in the 12th century on one occasion. But here, as you see, it's in an area surrounded by open ground. And this is a royal quarter, and it consists of the cathedral, the Old Minster, which I shall come to in a moment, the New Minster, which I shall come to in a moment, the site of what I think we can suggest is the Old English Royal Palace, and then, of course, Wolsey, the huge estate of the bishop, still existing today within the boundaries which date from the late 10th century. When you're inside Wolsey, the playing fields and the gardens and the grass and the orchards and the house itself, those boundaries, the great wall to the north, built in 1377, is on a line that goes right back to the later 10th century. Its eastern boundary is the same, and the other sides of the city wall. So there's a complete intact element, and it is pre-conquest, but I'm not going to talk about that any more this evening. But let us look at this map, which we've seen some part of already before. And this was originally drawn some time ago under the direction of my late wife, Bertha. And you'll see that not only is Wolsey, there's Bishop's Palace there, but there is an indication of the site, Royal Palace, to the immediate west of the sites of the Anglo-Saxon Old Minster Church and the Anglo-Saxon New Minster Church. We know a lot, really, relatively, about the arrangement of the New Minster site, and you can see it's divided into sectors there. We know much less about the arrangement inside this enormous sector to the south, which is the Old Minster, which later became, of course, the Cathedral Priory. But because we know a lot about the New Minster, partly from excavation, and partly from documents, but also from the fact that the western part of it, as you'll see in a few moments, was taken by William the Conqueror for the building of his aula, his hall, in the 4th year of his reign, so that's 1069 to 70. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But I want to look at these two great churches. They have, of course, an immensely long history. And that is very well seen on John Crook's photograph here, taken from the north transept, looking west along the site, along the axis really almost, of the Oldminster Cathedral Church, the only one that is known in its entirety from excavation in Anglo-Saxon England so far. We have a lot of knowledge for Canterbury's nave, but no knowledge about its east end, and so forth and so on. But here we have a complete Anglo-Saxon plan. And in the centre, laid out in this brickwork, you can see the plan of a smaller, a rectangular building with a north and south square and an eastern square, and that is the 7th century church. Certainly in existence by 663, when a bishop was intruded into this area for the first time by the King of Wessex, possibly 10, maybe a few more years older than that, say back to about 650, but we can't be sure. But that's the axis, that's the old church, and onto that, all those extensions, which you can see laid out there in the whiter brick, or what appears to be whiter brick, shows how the Oldminster developed in a long series of stages throughout the Anglo-Saxon period until 1093, when its demolition began with the move of the monks headed by their bishop, leading from the Oldminster into the new Norman cathedral, of which the eastern arms, the presbytery and the north and south transept and a few bays of the nave had been completed. And they moved, and then in the following year, in 1 year, the Oldminster was demolished. Now, why is there a 7th century church inside the walls of Winchester? And that really is the problem to which I want for a few moments to turn, because I think really it's quite fundamental. Why build a church strongly influenced by North Italian, specifically Milan diocese architecture of a cross-plan church with a very complicated, simple but complicated mathematical ratio in its planning? Why build that in the centre of a ruined Roman city? And ruined Roman city it certainly was. We've done a great deal of work on this recently in preparing our Historic Towns Gazetteer. And one thing we can say pretty surely is that the essential fabric of the Roman town, its buildings, including its forum, its Roman street plan, of which you see a part there, highly regular, 32 building blocks of it altogether, that simply has failed. But nevertheless, into what you might imagine is a deserted ruin field, a very sophisticated church of clearly itself of royal origin is intruded sometime in the 3rd quarter of the 7th century. And to answer that, I think we have to look briefly, at least, at the Itchen Valley in this earlier period. Now, if there's one thing one learns from studying the transition from Roman society to early medieval society from the continent, and particularly indeed from the great rivers of Germany down the Rhine in particular, and then on the Danube, it is that these Roman places, they cease to act as civilized Roman places, but they are not wholly abandoned. They remain centers of power. They remain foci. And from those foci, there emerge the elements which come to make the medieval towns. And the evidence for the crucial period of transfer from, shall we say, the 4th century to the 7th century, the same more or less in Germany as here, though there's very early Christianity there, which there are major surviving elements, is that these places, these former Roman places, both great and large, are surrounded by burial grounds. Some of those burial grounds, as the great ring of churches around Cologne or around Trier, clearly the Christian burial grounds with associated Christian burial churches in the cemeteries continue. In others, in parts of Germany which are more fully Germanized at an earlier date, and they may just be in interstices of the still somewhat slightly remaining Romanitas, they are marked out by the concentration around those places of pagan cemeteries. Quite clearly, not Christian cemeteries, pagan cemeteries, of inhumation burials, mostly in Germany, with Germanic equipment very well-known types of bronze work and metal and so forth, and weapons. And we have exactly the same around Winchester, because those dots that cluster in the upper Itchen or the middle Itchen Valley around Winchester, particularly to the northeast but also to the south, represent the known distribution of Anglo-Saxon cemeteries beginning already in the middle of the 5th century AD. This is a time when the Roman cemeteries of Winchester itself are coming to an end, as been very clearly demonstrated in the excavations at Lank Hills, where a famous photograph done by the Winchester School's Archaeological Committee and led by Giles Clark shows the burials just petering out. So there are dozens of burials in the foreground of the photograph, and it peats out to native chalk, which is interrupted just by a few grave bits and then by none at all. It's the most dramatic demonstration of the end of organised burial life, if I can put it that way, in a Roman community. But in the hills and valleys roundabout, there are new cemeteries building up. They're quite different. They're certainly pagan. There's a late phase of them which is beginning to Christianize in the 7th century, but the 5th and 6th centuries are clearly pagan. There are weapon burials. The women are buried with gear, which is quite clearly Germanic, and the weapons with the men are clearly Germanic, and they are round about forming a concentration on Winchester, such as you see there. There's a similar concentration, interestingly, around Old Sarum, which brings up really important questions about the origins of Wiltshire. Not Wilton at that stage. The cemeteries are really around Old Sarum itself, as a question which needs addressing. But I would argue that what is happening with Winchester is whatever is going on inside the walls, and there is very early Germanic pottery inside the walls at Winchester, some of it from the Brook Street site, so similar to that which is being found in the North German sites at Feddersenwerder near Kiel, for example, that when I took our Winchester sherds over to Wilhelmshaven to compare them with the excavated material there, thank goodness their material was marked and our material was marked, because otherwise we would not have known at all. I'm not suggesting they're imported Germanic sherds, but they're using the same sort of procedures for making this very crude and sometimes decorated, very, very distinctive pottery. So I think the link we're looking for is what happens in the post-Roman period. This is an important Romano-British city, 5th largest in Britain, heavily fortified in the late Roman period, with bastions on the walls, of which the evidence is beginning to come to light now, and with a very great increase in the number of burials in its cemeteries until they die away, as I've described. So late Roman Winchester is important, and round about it, in the period for which it's so difficult to trace what's happening inside the walls, we get this arrangement of Anglo-Saxon villages, of course that's what these represent, farms and villages, with their own burial grounds. And that, I think, is the essential link for which we're looking. And therefore, when we come back to a plan of the central part of Winchester and ask ourselves why there is a church founded inside Winchester in the 7th century, it is, I think, because, difficult as it is to define, it is still a centre not of a continuing power, but of a new replacement power represented by the Germanic peoples, which, and their names of course are present in the Old English genealogies of Wessex, but so are non-Germanic names as well, present as intermingling going on. And in a book which we shall mention to you later, our author has shown that in her study of 3,000 burials excavated in Winchester in the last 30 years, there is essentially no population change, except in the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries, where she has been able to define a group of tall males arriving. Well, we know where they came from. And Oxford has recently done a genetic study of the genetic history of the British Isles on totally different evidence, published in Nature, and shown exactly the same situation on the basis of DNA, that the changes come in the form of males in 5th, 7th, 6th, 7th, they rather say 8th century, but the dating is very different. Of course, their work is based on modern DNA and arguing back from that, but the results are congruent. So I think the reason we have a palace here or royal centre here, is that there are links. They're very difficult to define. They have to be looked at in terms of what's happening elsewhere in the country and what else happening elsewhere in Europe. But nevertheless, there are links, and I think that is why the Old Minster is founded here in the third quarter of the 7th century. And I think it is very much why the New Minster is founded here in 901 to 3 and became immediately a burial church, possibly for Ealhswith even before the church was finished, Alfred himself being moved from Old Minster into New Minster as soon as New Minster was dedicated, and then other members of the royal family. We're not going to go into that in detail. Barbara is the master of this at any rate, and it's very complicated, and we have all sorts of questions. Why isn't X buried there? Why is X or Y buried somewhere else? But there is clearly a situation which by the 11th century, by the time before Canute arrived, must have meant that New Minster was the royal burial church of Wessex par excellence. There are others, but only New Minster's got this great sequence of burials, and the people who lived their lives in and around New Minster obviously felt their church was of immense importance, but that's not something we're going into this evening. What did happen was that things went wrong for New Minster after just before the conquest. Part of its site burnt down. It was unwise enough to allow its abbot to fight at Hastings, and it was most certainly not popular with the conqueror. And in fact, part of the site was then by the conqueror for the building of his aula. And there you see, in 963 to 1065, you see the complex site of New Minster to the north with its subdivisions, and then from the 4th year, in fact, of the conqueror's reign, the royal palace for the aula is extended up to High Street. 12 houses on High Street were lost at the same time. A street was blocked, and an aula was built there. This is it is quite clear that the sources which are good there include Domesday Book, after all, which is strictly contemporary. And there are other sources too which are later, but have to be read in relation to the Domesday evidence. It's clear that this, although not described as something like that, is an extension, and that the extension is for a new palace site for the conqueror. And it takes place, as you can see, on the left-hand side. Now, here you will see that Derek Keane and I have been uncharacteristically rash, have inserted the Hall of William I in dotted outline in the middle, just to the north of New Minster there, and on part of what was the New Minster site. That's the same size as the hall at Westminster. We don't know whether it lay east-west or north-south, or even conceivable diagonally, but that seems unlikely. What you should see, of course, is that it is very big. Westminster Hall is the largest royal hall we have. I'm not saying it is that size, neither Derek nor I would argue that, but it is not out of scale with the cathedral, which enormous westworks are shown there overlapping Old Minster, which, as I've said, Eric Fernie has described as a church of imperial pretension, which was being built from 1073 or so onwards, and then dedicated in 1093 for the eastern arms only, though the nave will have been laid out but not completed for perhaps 20 years. So I think, strangely enough, it's the evidence for the Conqueror's Hall which enables us to quite helpfully, I think, define where the pre-conquest hall was too. Now, whether in fact, of course, this survived, we don't know. But that is English heritage picture of the Great Hall of Westminster about 1100. I'm not for a moment suggesting that the hall built by the Conqueror at Winchester was of that scale. It may have been. It will fit, as you can see. It could be, but we just simply don't know. But the Westminster Hall is the closest parallel we have. And you can see it there in the snow. Now I'm going to go back for a few things. My side is not a very good one because it was taken from David Wilson's marvellous coloured publication of the Bayeux Tapestry, and it's too big for my scanner. But David suggests that that hall is at Winchester rather than Westminster. Whether he's right or not, he says only probably at Winchester. And all I would say is that the building shown there is not the same as the one which is quite clearly Westminster, where Edward the Confessor is dying, shown later in the tapestry. It does look architecturally different. And in terms of movement, well, Edward is sending Harold across water, and he's about to go to Bosham, which is the next building shown down on the tapestry. So it may be that we have an idea of what a late stage of the Anglo-Saxon palace at Winchester actually looked like, in which case there it is presumably got 4 towers, I should say 2 at each one corner and probably 2 at the other. A very fine door with great hinges shown there. And then we have a sort of cross-section showing Edward the Confessor talking to Harold and with another person around. So we can't be certain what we know about the royal palaces at Winchester, but Winchester's ecclesiastical buildings are fully comparable to, not precisely in design, in scale and elaboration and in complexity of history, to those which mark the great German sites like Aachen. And indeed, Newminster appears to have been laid out to the same plan that Pepin laid out for the church we now know as Saint-Denis, and which his son Charlemagne completed, having buried his father in the immediately west of the church and eventually extending Saint-Denis over it. So there is a congruence. Now, how will we find out any more? Well, it's difficult. Most of these sites cannot be excavated. Obviously, the cathedral to the west of the cathedral site is under the cathedral graveyard. That can't be excavated. There may be other ways of looking at it, and we're thinking about that. With regard to the Hall of the Conqueror, it's clearly a very high priority that any investigation, however small, in the streets or below the buildings of the area of the Market Square and up to High Street does need not only to be very carefully reviewed for what already may have been seen, but very carefully observed for what may turn up in the future. So although Barbara and I are reasonably cautious about exactly what was here, very cautious about what was actually here, I think the context that we have, whether it be from the documentary evidence for meetings with all the problems that surround it, or whether it be the continental parallels, is that there is a major Anglo-Saxon palatial complex in that area of Winchester, and it's that and its origins which actually, leading back to the resettlement of the Winchester area, or the continuing settlement of the Winchester area in the Dark Ages, gives the context for the church, and the church itself and its buildings find their context in the fact that this was a place of royal power. Thank you.